Welcome to welcome to our second webinar, the deep dive series. Um, it's great to see you. I hope some of you were here for our first event. And as you can see here, I'm not sure how you've heard about us today. We're going to find that out a little bit later, but please take the opportunity to follow us on our social media channels or check out our website. And just for a sense of who's here today, I'm going to have Carolyn lead a couple quick polls.
Okay, hi everyone. We're going to start the first poll here. Is this your first time attending one of our Hamilton Harbour Deep Dive webinars? So if you have joined us before, we had our first one back in December. It was a fantastic session. If you haven't had the chance to check it out, it is recorded on our website. Seeing a lot of answers coming in. Let that go for another second here. I'll share the results here. 72% say yes, you have, so welcome back. And to those who haven't, welcome. Got another question here. How familiar are you with the Hamilton Harbour Remedial Action Plan? And since many of you have been to one of our webinars already, perhaps a bit more familiar, take a second there. Okay, this should be about everybody there. Thank you for participating. So about 54% somewhat familiar, 18 very familiar, and 29 not at all familiar. Hopefully at the end of this, you'll feel a bit more familiar with it. Another question here. Oh, sorry, one second. Have to stop sharing that first one. There we go. Okay, do you think that the fish in Hamilton Harbour are healthy? So here we're just looking for your perception of this, and we'll get some results going later this webinar. Give that a second here as people answer. Great, thank you for participating. So we're seeing about 42% saying no, 23 saying yes, and 35 saying don't know. And that's what you're here to see today, learn a bit more about that. Okay. And one last one to start us off today. Do you actively fish in Hamilton Harbour? Whether that's recreationally or for food as well. Okay, that's a pretty quick one. Thanks, everyone. Seeing about 77% saying no and 23% saying yes. Okay, so with that in mind there, I will turn it back to Kristen.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start us off with our land acknowledgement. We recognize and respectfully acknowledge that the land that we speak about today is the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and territory of the Haudenosaunee and Neutral Nation. This territory is covered under the Between the Lakes Treaty Number 3 of 1792. Together, we practice wise stewardship on the land and water in which we all share. Just want to run you just through what you can expect for this evening. I will be kicking us off with just a very brief update and overview of kind of what a remedial action plan is for those that have not been able to attend before. We're going to have two guest speakers today. We'll have an update from Fisheries and Oceans Canada on the status of the fish population of Hamilton Harbour. We'll have an opportunity for a question period following that. You can enter your questions in the Q&A box that's at the kind of bottom of your screen, probably in around the middle. You can type in your questions there and Mike will go through and address them. You're welcome to enter your questions during the presentations. You don't have to wait till the end. When that's finished, we're going to have Colin Oakes from the Hamilton Conservation Authority give an update on their works, particularly focused on the work that they do about fish. Again, there'll be another opportunity for questions for Colin, and then we'll close it off with a couple more polls at the end and see how you felt about everything. Thank you so much for joining us. So I am Kristen O'Connor, and I am the coordinator of the Hamilton Harbour Remedial Action Plan. Some of you might wonder, what's a RAP? In the 1980s, the International Joint Commission, a binational group dealing with boundary water issues, identified 43 sites around the Great Lakes as areas of concern. These sites were where water quality and ecosystem health have been severely degraded by human activities. Each AOC has its own Remedial Action Plan, or RAP, a locally developed, partnership-driven plan that guides restoration efforts. The goal of the RAP is to address historical environmental issues and ultimately remove the area from a list of AOCs, a process called delisting. There are a number of watersheds that drain into Hamilton Harbour, originating in Hamilton, Burlington, and Puslich. Perhaps you live, work, or recreate in one of these areas. A beneficial use, excuse me, a beneficial use impairment, or BUI, describes a human or ecological use of the ecosystem that has been degraded because of human-caused environmental problems. Going back to those areas of concern, there were a list of 14 potential beneficial use impairments, or BUIs, for every area of concern, providing all of us with a common language. You can see here, Hamilton Harbour's historical environmental conditions led to most of the 14 BUIs being applied here. For each beneficial use impairment, environmental goals called delisting criteria are developed that describe the environmental conditions that will be achieved once all actions have been completed. The delisting criteria are used to guide restoration efforts, and progress is measured against them. When all actions have been completed and the delisting criteria have been met, a BUI status change is proposed in a redesignation report. These are just a few of the remedial actions partners have been working on for years that you might recognize. Are you inspired? Want to learn more? On our website, you can find information on all of the beneficial use impairments and key reports. Again, you can also follow us on social media to stay up to date. Today, we're going to focus on BUI 3 and particularly BUI 3A, which is the status of fish populations in Hamilton Harbour. And I'm pleased to be able to introduce John Midwood. Dr. John Midwood is a research scientist with the Great Lakes Laboratory for Fisheries and Aquatic Scientists at Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Research within his lab is applied in nature and designed to support managers within Fisheries and Oceans Canada, as well as the recovery of Great Lakes areas of concern. The lab uses acoustic telemetry to better understand the core ecology of freshwater fishes, fish community surveys to document trends and differences among habitats, and develops models to help map the physical components of fish habitat. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks so much for the invitation to present today. So I'll just get my slides going here. I hope everyone's enjoying the afternoon, the blustery day out there. Okay. So as Kristen mentioned, today I'll be speaking about the current status of fish populations in the Hamilton Harbour area of concern. So my lab has done a variety of projects over the years, and first off, just this past year, we actually published a report, and I'll throw this up here, and there's a QR code there should you wish to scan it. You're welcome to download the report. It's available on the DFO website. But this
John,
was
we're
a
not seeing your
multi-agent.
slides yet.
They're
Sorry.
not. Oh,
Nope.
okay. 1 second.
That's okay. I wasn't sure if you were doing a preamble, then I'm like, nope, nope.
Nope. They're supposed to be there. How about that? Is that working?
Something's coming. Oh, there we go. Yes.
There we go. Okay,
Sorry
excellent.
to interrupt.
No, thank you for interrupting, and apologies for that. I'll move that out of the way. We're good there still? Great. Okay, so as I was saying, we completed an assessment of the status of fish populations just last year, and it's published here. It was a multi-agency effort. Lots of variety of data sources were pulled into it, and different groups got together, and took us multiple years to kind of piece this whole thing together. And the bulk of what I'll be speaking about today is the findings of this report, but a big shout out to everyone who contributed to this big project. So as Kristen noted, here in the lower Great Lakes, we have this map that shows the different types of land use we find within our watersheds. And extensive agricultural urbanization is sort of the prevalent land use type in Southern Ontario. And as a result, we've got lots of issues in our waters related to eutrophication and changes in supply of habitat for species like fish. I won't dive into the AOC stuff again, but basically Hamilton Harbour is one of the many AOCs in the Great Lakes region. And this all dates back to 1987 when the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was signed between Canada and the United States. And in particular, today we're going to be talking about the degradation of fish populations, which is one of those 14 beneficial use impairments we heard about. So Hamilton Harbour, going back not too far, this is a picture from the early 1900s. There was a pretty substantial recreational fishery here in the system. Folks were still able to catch and consume species like whitefish, and lots of great ice fishing happening on the harbour. And I think I saw some huts out there this year. So this tradition is still ongoing to this day, which is excellent. But if you take a look at this really interesting map from 1909, you can see how the harbour has changed since that time quite extensively. Particularly along the south shore, there were lots of inlets and bays and wetlands that were a key feature of habitat for fishes. But for a variety of reasons, those areas were infilled over the years that led to the loss of habitat. And the top left figure there, up over here, is showing us in orange the areas that have been infilled to make more land in the system. As a result, after that productive fishery, overfishing, habitat loss, eutrophication all led to the extirpation and declines of a lot of our different species. So we used to have Cisco in the system, which is a cold water fish, as well as Atlantic salmon, among others. And so that led to the areas of concern being identified. And then within that, we get these specific population objectives. And so I'm going to walk through just really briefly here some of what these objectives look like. So the first one is focused on the fish community in general. And our goal is to meet these objectives before we would assess that the population is recovered. So first off, what we would like to see is a decline in species that we think are primarily linked to eutrophic or high nutrient conditions. So those are your brown bullhead, your common carp, alewife, and white perch. We want to see those species numbers decline. We would like to see mesotrophic species that sort of thrive when conditions are there's less nutrients in the system. So that's your sunfish, your yellow perch, and your white sucker. We'd like to see those increase in the harbor. We'd also like to see an increase in some of our top predators, so your largemouth bass, your walleye, or your pike. And finally, in the system, we'd like to see a decline in the numbers of non-native species, so things like common carp, goldfish, rudd, and round goby. So that's our first objective for populations here. The second one is focused on a very specific metric that we derive from our fish community catch information, and that's called an index of biotic integrity. And so our lab goes out and samples using a boat electrofisher that shocks the water, and we collect all the fish that are present within a sort of fixed 100-meter section of the shoreline. We can then take that catch information and derive different kinds of metrics. So the types of species that are present, the number of species, whether there's invasive species there, the amount of biomass in the system, so just the weight of the fish that are present. We can bundle all those together to arrive at a single index of biotic integrity, or IBI score. And that ranges from a low of 0 up to a maximum of 100. And so it's an index that's used throughout the Great Lakes to assess the condition of fish communities and habitats. And here in Hamilton, we have a target. We'd like to see a score between 55 and 60 in our IBI. So in terms of how we actually approach the assessment, there's lots happening here, but it's really just going to be a guide that helps us walk through this assessment. So those two objectives, we looked at a variety of different lines of evidence to see whether we were meeting those objectives. And we looked at different types of ways of sampling the fish community, and also looked at things like the trends through time. So are things trending towards the direction we want to see? We also compare the conditions in Hamilton Harbour with other areas in Lake Ontario to see whether we're seeing improvements in Hamilton, while maybe the rest of the lake is getting better or worse as well. And within the harbor, we also have some fixed locations where we do our sampling. And here specifically, we're talking about our boat electrofishing surveys. And so the different colored dots here show the different zones of the harbor where we did our analyses. So there's the west end, the north shore, and the east end. The nature of this sampling method means we can't actually collect fish along the south shore because it's just too deep. In the bottom map, what you can see is all of Lake Ontario and some of the other areas we go to collect fish that we can use as sort of a reference zone for Hamilton Harbour. So places in the Bay of Quinte, but also Frenchman's Bay, which is just east of Toronto, and then Jordan Harbour as well along the south shore. So we've got these different sources of information we can kind of bring together. So before my time, the lab actually had started sampling the harbor quite extensively. And this dates back to our first samples in 1988. And so the graph here is showing sort of when we sampled in Hamilton Harbor in the red dots along the top, and when we sampled in the Bay of Quinte along the bottom. And what you'll notice that there's years where we didn't sample in Quinte, but we sampled in Hamilton and vice versa. And so as a result, when we did our analysis, we actually had to break up our samples into different events or time stands, as we call these. And different things had happened through the course of this sort of 30-year time span that we needed to account for. And so, for example, in this first time stanza, we saw the invasion of dreisseniid mussels, so that's your zebra or quagga mussels, into Lake Ontario and also in Hamilton Harbor. And so that had an effect of reducing the amount of nutrients in some of these systems. Moving into our second time stanza, lots of activity during period 2, but we saw the installation of the Coots Paradise fishway in 1996. There was the first detection of non-native round goby, another for initial detection of non-native rudd, so 2 invasive species showed up in our system. And then we saw increasing numbers of species like cormorants, which was a positive sign for the system because they're naturally occurring here and they were recovering, but that also has fisheries implications because fish are one of their primary sources of food. Moving into period 3, I saw increasing catch of non-native goldfish. They'd been here since the 70s, but we saw their numbers really start to tick up in 2006 and beyond, as well as the provincial government began stocking walleye as a top predator to get them reestablished in the system. And that was quite successful starting in 2012. And so period 3 and period 4 are distinguished sort of by those events. So for analysis, we broke up and looked at trends through these 4 different time periods through time. So stepping back just briefly to a rubric here, I'm going to talk about this very first line, which is looking at what we call FP1A, which was a species-specific analysis of the trends and also differences between Hamilton and the Bay of Quinte. So briefly, we have our targets again for the specific fishes that we want to look at, increasing and decreasing. And then we're going to use something at the bottom here called a sparkling plot, which is just a way of visualizing trends through time through these 4 different time stanzas. So when we see it's red, it means that the overall trend is a decreasing trend. If it's blue, what it means that we might have seen an increase during period 2 and period 3 relative to our first initial period, but maybe there's now been a decrease since then. And then when it's green, that's actually an increasing trend in terms of our catch of these fishes. And finally, for some species, we see no change at all. So that's sort of how we look at across all 4 of those time stanza, but we also did a quick comparison too to look at the conditions when the system was first identified as an area of concern, and then the most recent time period, so periods 1 versus period 4. So in terms of our eutrophic fishes in Hamilton, the good news here is that we do see declines in catch of all 4 of our species through that time series, so all those red lines for Hamilton, that's HH. In the Bay of Quinte, declines as well for common carp and brown bullhead. Also in Hamilton, if we compare period 1 to period 4, there are statistically significant changes which we'd like to see in some of these species in terms of declines. However, looking at our mesotrophic fishes, the yellow perch, your native sunfishes, pumpkin seeds, and wet sucker, for the first 3 species, we saw an initial uptick in their numbers, which was a good indicator from period 1 to period 2. However, for those 3 species, since then, we've actually seen either a decline for native sunfishes and pumpkin seed in particular, or no change between period 1 and period 4. So there's a bit of a shift, a bit of an increase followed by a decline in some of these fishes. Overall, as well for wet sucker, we do see a decline in their catch across the time series. And some of those similar patterns are also observed in the Bay of Quinte, but generally in Bay of Quinte, we see fewer changes for most of these species. Looking at our top predators in the harbor, we did find a decline in smallmouth bass. A bit of an increase from walleye, and that's largely related to that stocking event. So it happens in that final period 4, we'd see that uptick. No change in northern pike and initial increase and then a decline thereafter for largemouth bass. In contrast, in Bay of Quinte, for most of those species, there actually have been declines, but that's actually largely related to declines in the amounts of nutrients in that system that have led to overall declines in the amount of biomass, which is generally sort of a positive indicator for the Bay of Quinte. And then finally, if you look at our goldfish species that we're able to model, so the rudd and the goldfish and the native species, we see increases in Hamilton, and neither one of these species are currently detected in the Bay of Quinte. We weren't able to use our electrofishing data to look at round goby for a variety of reasons, but basically we don't catch them very well because they're so focused on the bottom part of the basin. So overall, looking back at what we wanted to see versus what we did see declines in eutrophic fishes, which is a positive indicator. However, we did not see those increases in our mesotrophic native fishes. There were some mixed responses for top predators with either no change or a positive sign of walleye increasing in numbers, at least in Hamilton. And then unfortunately for our native species, with the exception of the common carp, which did decline, we saw increases in catch of those fishes. So looking at our assessment structure, once again, what we interpreted as was that the fish community based on this line of evidence remains impaired. So I'll jump down to the next one, which focuses on overall fish community. And there's a lot happening in this figure, but what this analysis really is if we take everything we catch across a whole year and put it into a model, it can actually tell us how similar our fish community is now and versus what it was back in 1988. And overall, what this analysis told us was that during that entire time period, the overall fish community has changed drastically at 6 locations in the harbor. And that was largely driven by decreases in common carp, white sucker, and alewife, which were quite prevalent in the early initial period of the system. And more recently, we're seeing increases in walleye, goldfish, and a species called gizzard shad, which is a native species. With our help from colleagues in multiple locations, RBG, Hamilton Conservation Authority, and Conservation Halton, we also did analysis looking at just species richness and species composition in some of the watersheds and the harbor itself. In the harbor, we saw an overall decline in species richness, so from 55 to 43, from our period 1 to our period 4. The sole exception being Red Hill Creek, where there have been some restoration actions done there, and there's actually been an increase in species richness. The positive sign from harbor perspective, is that a lot of the species that we didn't catch in the harbor during the most recent time series are still present within the watersheds. And that means if we can change the conditions of the system, those species are present and are able to recolonize back into the harbor. However, once again, looking at this line of evidence, while the fish community has changed drastically, we do still see evidence here of impairment. So for our first objective, the final section here looked at our pelagic fishes, or the fish that live in sort of the main part of the harbor. And to sample this, we actually used something called split beam hydroacoustics, which is a fancy way of saying we pinged sound into the water, and if it hits a fish's swim bladder, it actually pings back. And we get an idea of how big that fish is, and we can actually use it to count the number of fish that are present in the system. And so we did 2 sort of analyses here. One was looking at the conditions in Hamilton Harbor and Toronto Harbor, and also Open Lake Ontario. And so we did all that analysis, and basically the nice thing was that actually Hamilton Harbor density was either higher or equal to what we saw in Lake Ontario and Toronto. And the images on the right here are some work we did specifically within Hamilton Harbor. And what we found there was that the peak was really at the west end of the system. So the west end tends to have the most number and biomass of fish compared to the north and the central portions of the harbor. Interestingly here, and this will come up again, is what we found in the summer. And that's shown in the bottom right corner here with the green bars indicating at what depth going down on the water column did we catch or observe the fishes. And in the summer in Hamilton, what we have is a lot of nutrients, and the area below the thermocline, so the cooler part of the harbor, the oxygen is actually largely removed from that portion during the summer. And so we found using this approach is that all those smaller fishes are actually stacked up on top of that layer of poor oxygen waters, and they're really confined to the top portion of the system during that one season, whereas in the fall and the winter, or in the spring, they can move throughout the whole water column. So based on the contrast with Hamilton and Lake Ontario, what we said from this was really that these conditions are largely comparable to other available areas in the harbor. But again, for that fish community focused objective, at this point, we did not see that we're meeting that objective. So I'm going to shift now and talk about our second objective, which, just as a reminder, was focused around that index of biotic integrity. And so once again, we want to achieve that score of between 55 and 60. And we do a lot of our work here for this at night because we do see increased catch during that time period. So again, thinking about those time periods, the time stanzas, here we're looking at, I'll walk you through this, our IBI score through those 4 different time stanzas. We've broken up Hamilton into the west in blue, the north area in orange, and the east in red. And then the Bay of Quinte is sitting here as our reference along the top. And I've highlighted that Hamilton Harbor target of 55 to 60. And pretty quickly, you can see that consistently Hamilton Harbor is not achieving that 55 to 60 IBI score target in each of those 4 time stanzas, whereas the Bay of Quinte is typically at or above that target. Interestingly, too, in Hamilton, what we find over time is that initially those north, west, and east zones were similar, but over time they've actually become less similar. And conditions in the east end of the harbor and increasingly the north are showing us that the more impaired, so lower IBI scores, while the west end consistently has the highest scores within the system. So we did the same type of analysis for a wide variety of other metrics fish community metrics using the same e-fishing data to calculate these factors. And what we have here is the directionality we'd like to see if conditions were improving, so our desired response. So we have things like the total catch of fish during a transect, or the total number of native species present in the system. We'd like to see those metrics increase, and that's in black, whereas for the non-native species, we'd like to see declines in their catch as well as their richness. And so I'll show you here what we did find overall between that period 1 and period 4. If you look at the overall column here, unfortunately, we do see is that the trends in these metrics in the harbor are largely counter to what we'd like to see, with the exception that we are seeing some declines in the total catch of non-native species in the system, as well as some of the more offshore-oriented fishes. But our IBI score has not changed and really remains below that target. And these other metrics are also not largely changing. And we do see those spatial differences within the system that seem to be getting more apparent as we move through time. In contrast, if you look at the Bay of Quinte on the far right side of this table here, we don't see a lot of declines. If anything, it's actually declines in things like non-native species richness, as well as a few other metrics. So for this one, what we say is that IBI and metric values right now are pointed towards the system remaining impaired. So for our final piece to focus on this objective, we turn to our colleagues at the provincial government, Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, who have a comprehensive trap netting program that they do all throughout the Bay of Quinte and Lake Ontario, and they also sample in Hamilton Harbour. The map on the right shows you where they go. The picture on the left there shows you what a trap net looks like when it's all folded up on a boat. So they also have an index of biological integrity they apply to their data. And looking here with our Hamilton Harbour mean shown, or the average value in orange, and the other areas outside of it in that blue, the provincial government interpret this as the Hamilton Harbour conditions being fair, which indicates it's an impaired sheltered embayment based on Lake Ontario conditions. But once again, we're not necessarily hitting that 55 to 60 target in the system. They also look at other components of the fish community. So they look at things like the proportion that's made up of top predators or piscivores. And that's what this bottom right panel is showing. And while there have been actually some improvements recently in this number, we've got a target of around 20% of your catch you want to be the top predators. We're not quite hitting that target consistently in Hamilton at this time, particularly when you compare it to areas that are not within the area of concern. So unfortunately, once again, for this objective, we see the IBI metrics again pointing towards impairment for the fish populations. So bringing it all together here to our assessment conclusions. So here we took what we call like an integrated evaluation. So we had Bay of Quinte to serve as our reference area, and we have Hamilton as the area of interest. And it was really helpful for us to sort of disentangle the things that maybe were changing in the lake-wide. So we do see things like declines in alewife being a pervasive issue across all of Lake Ontario. However, we know that other factors based on our analysis here is that were actually Hamilton-specific changes or declines in catch of some of our species. We see declines in common carp as a really positive sign, and that's largely due to the success of the Coutts Paradise fishway. In a lot of our data, you can see a big spike after the fishway goes in, so all the carp were pushed out into the harbour, and then over time, a steady decline in the number and biomass of carp in Hamilton Harbour. So that's a real success story. However, at the same time, what we have seen is increases in species like goldfish and rudd, and we do find that concerning because goldfish in particular behave in a similar fashion as common carp, but potentially can pass through that fishway. We found really marked differences in catch and community composition and metric scores at the different areas of the harbour. So the West End actually seems in some instances to be doing fairly well. And I'll speak about that again in just a second, whereas in contrast, that East End remains more impaired. And then finally, what we interpret this as really is that declining catch and richness of the native fishes seems to be inhibiting our population recovery at this time. And that overall, right now, the AOC fish populations, our assessment to deem them to be impaired or remaining impaired. So I'm going to pivot now and start just to briefly talk about some of the stressors and limiting factors that we identified as part of our assessment report, and then outline a few of the recommendations before I wrap up here. So this analysis, we kind of stepped back at the very end of the report and sort of said, well, what are the conditions like now? What are some of those stressors? And we talked about habitat loss and habitat impairment at the beginning of the talk today, and that remains a challenge in the system. There's a limited amount of habitat available for some of these fish species because of historic losses and ongoing issues with the condition of some of that habitat not being optimal. The plot here on the bottom left shows our land use changes through time, and we can see a steady increase in the Hamilton Harbour watersheds of urbanization, so conversion to urban land. And that also tells us that the populations of the watersheds are increasing through time. And that has an impact on the types of contaminants and loadings that go into the system. There's been excellent work ongoing and completed to upgrade a lot of our sewage treatment plants that flow into the harbor. However, with increasing people in the watersheds, there's increasing demand and on those treatment plants. And there can be other factors that may come out of that water that aren't initially screened. So things like cosmetics and pharmaceuticals that have a potential impact on some of the aquatic life in the system. We do still have challenges with water quality. There's been fabulous improvements in the amount of phosphorus in the system, declines through time, and ammonia in particular as well. But if you're down by the harbor in the summer, you'll still see these pervasive algal blooms in lots of areas, and that certainly poses a challenge for a lot of our fishes. And then I mentioned summer hypoxia. Hypoxia is just the lack of oxygen. And the bottom figure here is showing us basically throughout the summer period, as our thermocline sets up, you can begin to see the oxygen decrease, and the dark red is 0. So basically, it's for portions of the time throughout the year, the middle, deeper pockets of the harbor below 10 meters, there's very little oxygen in that portion of the harbor. And that's a major limiting factor for some of our species. And we do see species like walleye later in the summer actually moving from the harbor out into the lake because we think the conditions are too warm and there's not enough oxygen for them. From a more biotic perspective, colleagues of mine at DFO and other groups have done lots of work looking at the food that fish eat. So your lower trophic, your zooplankton, little tiny insects in the water. And what they find is that there's actually an abundant supply of these zooplankton at certain times of year. And it doesn't seem like the fishes are there to actually consume them. So there's food there, which is a really good thing, but it's not readily being accessed by our fishes. In the benthic or the bottom of the harbor realm, there are inverts down there, but they're pretty limited because of that oxygen and the lack thereof during the summer that limits what can grow down there. So lots of it's just sort of a flat, muddy bottom, and that's a limiting factor for some species. Aquatic invasive species will directly compete with our native fishes and can also alter habitat, so carp can disturb the waters. And then we have this sort of challenge with predation, which is a totally natural part of the ecosystem. But if the system is imbalanced, then predation can help or sort of prevent it from really recovering and pose challenges. So from this sort of review of stressors and limiting factors, I'll talk through just a few of the recommendations. There were 11 in total that came out of the assessment. One of the first one was the need to sort of determine the amount of habitat and see whether the habitat supply is a limiting factor here in the system. And also that can inform opportunities for habitat improvement. And so we used telemetry, which lets us track fish in real time and link that with habitat information to develop super fun models. But the cool thing about the models, we actually could apply them back into the system. And that's what we're seeing here for largemouth bass. And we did it seasonally. So here's what the conditions optimal are for them in the spring, the summer, the fall, and the winter. And with that information in hand, we can see where bass may be inhabiting the harbor, which tends to be primarily the west end. However, we can also, for a variety of different species, I think we did 7 in total, we actually can quantify the amount of habitat available in each season. And so this next figure shows that, apologies, it was 6 species for our 6 species. So the amount of habitat in square kilometers available in the system. And for bass, you can see that there's the green here is actually your summer, and there's definitely a dip in the summer in the amount of habitat available. So that's a limiting factor for bass, is the availability of summer habitat. And the model here actually has information on what that habitat looks like that we can use to help inform potential remediation measures. Walleye is another good example of a big summer dip, and as I mentioned, that's a big, we think largely related to that summer hypoxia that limits the amount of habitat they can use. Another recommendation was to assess the recruitment potential for key native species. And so right now we're doing work looking at walleye, which have been stocked into the system with great success starting in 2012. So they released juvenile walleye into the system, and over time they've grown, and there's a really substantial adult population. And starting in 2016, we observed them spawning throughout the whole harbor. So works we're doing now are actually looking at the full life cycle of walleye and trying to figure out where in that life cycle is there maybe a limiting factor that stops them from recruiting naturally in the system, because we want to promote that so we don't have to stock anymore ideally. Good news is over here, this graph here is we did a lot of habitat work. There's good spawning habitat. That's good news. We did some work with egg mats to look at whether they're dropping eggs, and yes, they are. And we've actually found fertilized eggs in the system, which is also a good news sign. However, these mats, if you look at them, they're covered in sand and muck, and that's a problem. That will actually limit the recruitment of the walleye system. This past year, we did a really extensive work looking for larval walleye in the harbor, and we did not find any. And so we think, based on that and a few other signs later on in the life cycle, we do see those, stocked fish surviving. So that's a positive. If they can get to that fry and juvenile phase, we think they can survive. So right now we're keying in on that egg to larval life phase as a limiting factor in their recruitment here in the harbor, and try to identify what specifically might be limiting that life phase. As I mentioned, aquatic invasive species or non-native fishes are a major problem, and we're doing work right now focused on goldfish, and next year we're going to pivot and look at rudd in more detail. But we've got a couple options for management of these aquatic invasive species in the system. One being something called active management, and that's here on the left. And what that means is actively going out there to catch them and remove them from the harbor. And this is a fabulous graph. This is what some of the tracking data we can get back. We actually know the depth of the fish as we track them. And so we can find out periods of time in the year when they may be at the right depth for us to catch them. And for goldfish in particular, that's what this graph is showing. They're largely available for capture in that early spring, right before they begin to move up into some of the tributaries and wetlands to spawn. So we think there's a potential intervention point there for goldfish where we could do some active management. Passive management relates to more with putting up barriers. So the Coots Paradise Fishway is a good example, although they actively pass the fish over. But the idea being you can put up bars that stop fish from accessing different areas, and that's been really effective in lots of systems for common carp. A challenge, however, for both the goldfish and the rudd, we think, is that they are much narrower in terms of width, and they can squeeze through the bars that would otherwise stop a carp. But we're exploring different ways, looking at their behavior, their sensory capabilities. So fish can actually sense things like sound and light and bubbles that may distract them or push them away from areas. And also the timing of when they're using these areas to help us guide towards maybe more effective passive management measures for these species. Just two more here. This one looked at the need for sort of continued monitoring. So we have, like I said, we've been doing this since 1988 on and off, alternating years generally. And we think it's a really important thing to continue because it was so useful for us to do this assessment. We need to continue sampling fish communities, not only in Hamilton, but also throughout all of Lake Ontario. So the figure here is showing we do work in Hamilton. Our colleagues in Toronto, the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, sample extensively in that area of concern. And then we also, all the yellow areas, those are areas we've sampled over the past 2 years. So a really comprehensive database of what conditions are like throughout all of Lake Ontario, and that's really useful and informative for our evaluations. And ties in really with the final recommendation that came from this work, which was to review the fish population criteria to assess their achievability. And what does that mean? Well, we talked about the differences in the IBI scores in the zones of the harbor, the west versus the north versus the east. And so that led us to sort of think more about, are the conditions different in these zones? That's the pure physical habitat conditions. So maybe we actually need to have slightly different targets for those different areas. And so some work we're doing right now is using that extensive electrofishing database and pairing it with information about where that location is situated and the physical habitat features. So what's the depth of the site? How does the shoreline slide into the water? What's its slope, basically? How far away is that site from places where fish will spawn? Things like wetlands or marinas or rivers, or where can they find shelter? Those different factors. And we can combine that all into a model that we can then use to predict what the conditions should be in locations of Hamilton Harbour based on what we see in the rest of Lake Ontario. And so some preliminary results from that work look like this. And what this is if it's light green or dark green, that means it's similar to what we would expect based on other parts of Lake Ontario. If it's blue, the values, the IBI scores in this case specifically that we see at that location is actually better than we would expect. So that's a good sign. Whereas if it's orange or a darker orange, it's worse or getting much worse further and further away. And so as a preliminary look here, what we see in the harbor when we apply this model back into the system is that once again, that west end is actually doing quite well. It's either similar to or better what we would expect based on the conditions at that site. And that's a good news story. In the middle part of the harbor, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Some sites are doing okay, others not so much. But if we look at the east end, we see increasingly more of that orange or light orange, which is indicating that it's performing more poorly than we'd expect based on those conditions. And using this type of analysis can actually help us tease out what factor is maybe limiting the fish populations in that specific part of the harbor. And again, to help us guide future restoration actions in the system. So that's everything I have for you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you may have. Once again, I've thrown up the QR code there if you'd like to scan it and interested in reading more. The report itself is far too long, as Kristen can attest, but there's lots of really interesting tidbits all peppered throughout. So thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you so much, John, for that great presentation. And I can definitely tell we have a lot of interested folks on the call. So we have a bunch of questions, which is awesome. I think I'll try and group them as best I can, and we can kind of go through them accordingly. And I know we have about just under 10 minutes to go through some of these questions. And if we do run out of time, I trust that, John, you can take a look at the questions and answer them as we go on. So the first couple of questions really talk about walleye. I know you did cover it, but maybe just to summarize quickly for the group, just in case. The first question is, from all fishing accounts, walleye are thriving in the bay. Does your team share the same views? And then the second question, quite similarly, is asking, can you give us an update on the walleye population in the harbor? I know you did cover it, but maybe just a quick summary for folks.
Yeah, just briefly. So as I said, that it's a stock population, which we think is actually thriving and doing quite well. So the growth rates initially when they were first stocked into the harbor were actually amongst the highest in Lake Ontario. So you've introduced a novel top predator into a system. They're doing very well. They grew very quickly, great sizes. More recently, the MNR says that they're actually comparable to what we see in the Bay of Quinte. So again, their walleye are thriving. There's a healthy adult population of walleye in the system. However, our recent work is suggesting that without that stocking, that walleye population would no longer be present. So the stocking is necessary sort of in the long term to maintain that as a fishery. There is a challenge a little bit though, because we have this abundant walleye population. It does have an impact on some of the native species because that's their prey base and that's their forage base. And so there's a bit of a decision point here to be made as well, in the sense that the walleye is really important. It's really fabulous recreational fishery opportunities in the system. And we want to encourage that as much as possible and get people engaged in the harbor. But we need to find a way to balance sort of that thriving walleye population with the recovery of some of the other native fishes. And if we recover those native fishes, I think the walleye will do even better. Some of our tracking work on walleye find them moving throughout the system in the spring, the summer, the fall, and the winter. They're here year round. However, we do see later in the summer, about half the walleye we've tracked and tagged are moving out into Lake Ontario, and they travel as far afield as the Niagara River, if not beyond. So there's not only does this rec fishery and the stocking of walleye support works or sort of fishing in Hamilton, it's actually supporting a fishery that's slowly developing, I think, in all of Western Basin of Lake Ontario, which is really exciting and a great opportunity.
That's great.
So Mike, I hope that answered that question.
Absolutely, yeah. And maybe just to confirm again for folks, the next question is talking about stocking. So to piggyback a bit on that, is walleye the only stocked fish, or are there other natural spawn populations?
I believe walleye is the only species that's being stocked actively into the harbor at this time, and they are stocking in alternating years. So they stock here, I believe they just stocked in 2024, and they'll stock again in 2026. And the provincial government's also stocking in the opposite years in Toronto, which is really exciting too. So a chance to increase the number of walleye in the whole of Western Basin of Lake Ontario. And historically, walleye were a native species that were present. There's actually some fabulous records and discussion of them going back to the 1800s, when people would actually seine net them from the tributaries when they're coming into spawn, and that's one of the reasons that they were extirpated. But it was a fabulous fishery back then, and then I believe as of 1950s is when they were largely gone from the system. Although we think there was a very minimal population still present.
Okay. A question I've actually gotten from friends: if common carp is not desirable, if I caught one in Hamilton Bay, should I destroy it?
So you're allowed to take carp in the sense that, as a fishery and a rec fishery, you can take carp. There are, and I would point to Kristen, she's got fabulous information, so does the province, on what you can take and consume safely. And so I would encourage folks to review those documentations the province provides for any fish in the harbor. And they're updating them constantly too, so that's a really good thing to look at. For your, in the sense of, should you remove them to help us? I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. It's sort of up to you to make those kinds of decisions. It's not considered goldfish, for example, in Rudd. If you find them in the harbor and catch them, you're not supposed to put them back. So you should be killing those non-native species if you do catch them. Common carp don't have the same coverage as far as I understand it, but please someone correct me if I'm wrong. So I would leave it up to the individual decision to decide if you want to remove that carp. I would, however, not recommend, be careful how you dispose of it as well. There's been some challenges in the past, I believe, from RBG in terms of how the carp are disposed.
Yep, that's great advice. Thank you. Next one, are alligator gar seen anywhere in Hamilton Bay?
Uh, Good question. So what we have in the harbor is a huge population of a species called longnose gar. So they're the same genus as alligator gar. I'm not aware of any specific alligator gar being detected in Hamilton Harbor, but there has been another species, which is the spotted gar, which is actually a species at risk in Canada. There has been 1 or 2 instances where spotted gar have been found in the harbor, which is really exciting. And fun tidbit, we did a tracking study of longnose gar, which was the first of its kind, and we thought they wouldn't go anywhere. And sure enough, they went as far afield as Rochester. So they have an incredible capacity to move. And so we think that's why some of the spotted gar are popping out and out every once in a while is because of the movement. But alligator gar, I have not seen any or heard of any.
Okay, thank you. The next one from Tracy, we can wait till the end. That's kind of out of John's area of expertise and where he works. That's more related to the city of Hamilton, but either myself or I can actually answer it. I do work for the city of Hamilton, so I can answer that question if we have time, or type it in the chat or in the Q&A later. So for John, would the introduction or stocking of muskie, perhaps through Muskies Canada, be helpful with knocking down some of the non-native species like carp and goldfish?
A very good question. I think one of the challenges there is whether or not they would be able to thrive in the conditions of the harbor as they currently stand. So it's a similar challenges with the walleye, which is, are the conditions able to support the natural recruitment and survival of some of those top predators? And at this time, we don't think that they're able to. So my son just popping in to say hi.
That's fine.
All good. So it's an idea that's been floating around for a number of years, I believe, is the restocking or trying to stock muskies into the system. And it'd be really intriguing to try it, but I'd be really careful and really hesitant to do so because I'm not sure that it would be successful. And I don't know that they would have any more of an impact on the common carp and goldfish than our walleye that are out there. What I'll also say too is that one of the challenges for both goldfish and common carp is they size out very quickly in terms of what can be eaten. So a goldfish in the first couple of years of life certainly is prey for a muskie. However, once it gets past that and grows too large in the harbor, we see 2-pound goldfish that will no longer be eaten by those muskies. So I would worry then that they would again turn to our native species that are smaller bodied, and maybe we'd struggle there. So.
Okay. Next up is what causes hypoxia in the harbor?
Great question, and I will do my best, and I'm not my area of expertise, but my understanding is that basically there's lots of nutrients in the sediment of the harbor. The muck at the bottom of the harbor is full of nutrients. And in the summer, what happens with the thermocline, so it sets up and the water doesn't mix well. And so you get that separation in the water above and below the thermocline. And at the bottom of the harbor, there's a lot of production and basically animals by bacteria and whatnot breathing. And so they're consuming all the oxygen that's available. And they do that naturally. It's totally a natural process. However, when there's an excess amount of that and nutrients related to that, it pulls even more oxygen out of the water. And because it's stratified, there's no mixing. You can't get oxygen back into that bottom portion. And so that as the summer wears on, there's less and less oxygen, and there's no mechanism to get oxygen back into that benthic or the bottom section of the water.
Okay. Kristen, I'm just being mindful of the time. I think we have maybe time for one more question perhaps, or do you think you have time for more?
Yeah, maybe we could do one more, and then John, maybe if you'd be so kind, maybe you could answer some questions written in the chat.
Happy to do so, yeah.
That would be great. Okay.
Okay. Are the other harbors that you're monitoring large shipping routes or ports like Hamilton Harbor? Would this play a role or a large role in why fish numbers are taking a longer time to increase, as well as why the east end of the harbor in particular is seeing lower numbers?
That's a very interesting question. So we do work in Toronto. It has a port facility. I don't actually know how it compares to Hamilton. I don't think it's nearly as active as Hamilton. However, I don't know that the shipping itself would be a major limiting factor. There are ships throughout the lakes. There are ships in lots of different areas as well where we don't necessarily see these impairments to the fish populations. So I'm not sure to the extent to which that would directly affect the populations. The question about the east end is a really good one. And what we actually think is probably limiting the numbers on that east end of the harbor is a few things, actually. So first off, it's actually quite isolated from what we would typically think of as great nursery habitat. So we're far away from Coots Paradise. So the fishes that are in that east end of the harbor have to travel. If their nursery habitat is Coots Paradise, they have to go a long way to get there, and it's quite isolated from other similar sort of nursery areas. So that's one of the factors. Additionally, too, the prevailing winds in Hamilton tend to be westerlies or southwesterlies, which means that that east end of the harbor is very affected by wind and wave action throughout the year. So it's really, really a active and dynamic environment that is going to inherently limit the amount of fish that can thrive there. There's different species that can tolerate that, but most of them can't. So that also is a factor. Trying to think if there's anything else. And part of that, something I didn't talk about with the hypoxia issue, is that it's not stable. It doesn't just sit there. And so because we get these westerlies that blow in one direction for a long period of time, what it actually does is it pushes that thermocline I talked about down and pushes and pushes and pushes. And what that means is in the opposite direction, you should get that hypoxic water, low oxygen water pushing up into the water column. And when that wind stops, it sloshes just like a bathtub, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so at the really extreme ends of the harbor, right along the shore, if there's nothing to like block that lack of oxygen from pushing up, that will actually reduce the quality of that habitat for fish during that period of time when you get that upwelling and that sloshing back and forth of low oxygen waters occurring. So those are a few of the factors that limit the conditions in the east end. And again, that final recommendation I showed, that's why we're heading in that direction. We want to sort of like better characterize that east end to think about what might we expect there. And one final little tidbit is actually that east end is where we see a lot of walleye spawning and where we catch the most walleye spawning eggs because they like that exposed shoreline. So just because it's not overall maybe highly productive in terms of fish richness and whatnot, it maybe is an important part of the harbor for species like walleye that want to spawn in more exposed shoals and whatnot. So
okay, that's great. Thank you so much, John, for all those great answers. I think we're on to Colin. Kristen?
That's
thanks,
great. Fascinating as always, John. So next up, at each of our webinars, we are going to aim to profile one of our BAIT partners. So BAIT is our Bay Area Implementation Team, and this is just logos of all the different partners that are part of that. Colin Oakes is in his 8th year currently at the Hamilton Conservation Authority as the aquatic ecologist. He has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science from the University of Guelph, as well as Fish and Wildlife Technician and Technologist diplomas from Fleming College. Prior to joining HCA, Colin had worked for a mix of private, public, and non-for-profit sector positions in the field. He has always had a passion for nature and the outdoors, especially activities around water. And as a child, if there was a stream or a ditch nearby, Colin's parents were sure to find him exploring in it. Off to you, Colin.
Kristen. Just going to share my screen. There we go, full screen. Excellent. So I'm here to talk a bit about the work I do, which is I've titled this the Fish Beyond the Harbor because our work is concentrated up in the watershed rather than out actually in the harbor itself. So kind of from a picture here, this is Coots Paradise from just above at the upstream end of it. So essentially everywhere upstream from this area. So a bit of a summary of what I'm gonna go through. I'm gonna give a little bit of an introduction, talk a bit about the watershed, a little bit about water quality monitoring, some of the fish sampling, and then the bulk of it will be on a restoration project that we undertook, and then a little wrap up. So for an introduction, who's the Hamilton Conservation Authority? We're an environmental management agency. We're located at the western end of Lake Ontario. We were originally established in 1958, specifically as the Spencer Creek Conservation Authority. And then in 66, the rest of our watershed area was added and we were renamed the Hamilton Conservation Authority. We hold or manage about 4,400 hectares of land within the watershed. And our vision is a healthy watershed for everyone, and our mission is to lead in the conservation of watershed and of our watershed and connect people to nature. Who am I? I'm the aquatic ecologist. I run our aquatic resource monitoring program, which is sampling fish and bugs that live within the creeks of the watershed. And I develop and implement restoration projects like the one I will discuss a little later in the presentation. So our watershed extends from up in Pushlynch, kind of just south of the 401, down through Flamborough, down to the Dundas Valley, which is also includes Coots Paradise, and then out into the harbor, and then through further east, actually all the way into just a little bit into Grimsby. Our furthest east conservation area, the 50 Point Conservation Area, is actually divided in the middle between Hamilton and Grimsby. Essentially, one of the internal roads is the dividing line between Hamilton and Grimsby, so it's split amongst the two of them. And then we cover most of that urban area of Hamilton. Then moving on to the water quality component, this is run by our engineering team, and this is since the HRAP is really concentrating on a lot of the point source is within the harbor, like the wastewater treatment plants that were talked about. We look at actually the water courses and that non-point source pollution that could be entering and sort of identifying where it could be coming from to then try and work to solve it. So the team currently monitors about 11 sites. 5 of them are in Shadoak, 3 are in Ancaster Creek, 1 in Sulphur, 1 in Spencer, and then 1 in Bors. Combined, they collect about 286 samples per year. And they're looking specifically for watercourse-derived nutrients, sediment, and E. coli. They run and do annual averages and long-term trends within the water concentrations. And I think there's probably a plan later on for them to maybe expand this in a future deep dive. So just one little quick thing on there. And then for myself, the Aquatic Resource Monitoring Program, we have a set of sites located across the entire watershed. We sample benthic invertebrates and fish at both of these sites. The watershed is broken into 3 major areas. We have the upper watershed, which are all the green dots in the image to the right. So that's sort of more our upper Spencer Creek and Fletcher's Creek. And then down the second area is sort of the Dundas Valley area, which are all the yellow circles. And then that eastern end, which includes Red Hill, which is a tributary of Hamilton Harbor, and then beyond that, actually, into all the smaller tributaries that are directly feeding into the lake itself. Also within that area, every year we sample the annual sites to give us that control across the whole watershed as we move between those greater areas for each year's survey. The benthic invertebrate data feeds into our watershed report cards that we put out every 5 years, and 2023 was the last one that came out. And then our fish data is more looked at internally at this time. Sort of image below is my team actually from this summer working to identify some of the fish that we caught. And just as an example of what they're looking at in the viewer, I have this rainbow darter as an image for you to see sort of what they're seeing as they're working to identify the different fish that they've caught. This collection of data we keep in an SQL database. We have about 45,000 records now within that database. It was originally a HRAP sponsored project when it was created, and so it contains all the historic records that could be found at that time and extends back into, I think, the 70s, like MNRF records back then, and then extends all the way through to all the modern sampling that we're doing. And just pictured here are a few other samples of fish that we have caught within the Hamilton Harbor watershed as part of this sampling. We have common shiner at the top. On the right-hand side is the rainbow trout. On the lower end is river chub, and then on the left-hand side is the bowfin. Further to what we do with that, it's similar to what John had talked about with the Index of Biotic Integrity, the IBI. We have a separate type of calculation for the stream sites. And so all of those sites, every year that we sample them, we go through and actually run them through the IBI and rate them. And the table I have presented here is the results of the annual sites from this past 2024. To the right, I've actually plotted the 3 of the sites for the last 5-6 years, essentially 2019 to 2024, kind of showing there is a variation in what we get based on the results of each survey. Several of them are kind of more hovering along not a lot of variance, but Fletcher's Creek, which is actually our best creek, the top one with the purple line with the square boxes, that one varies quite a bit more, and it's that variation probably relates to we have, if the fish that we catch, there are some that are more rare than other ones. And if that site, say, happened to have a fisherman or someone walk through it prior to us getting there, we wouldn't know, and that may scatter those fish that we only catch 1 and 2s. If we miss them, that can impact this score, and that's probably what's happening with that. Pictured below is this one is from this is a similar rare spit fish that we get in Lower Spencer Creek. This is a stone cat, so a type of catfish that lives in streams. So a similar throughout our watershed, the what fish we can catch varies, and then those rare species varies as well. And then for the restoration project, this project queued out of another program that we had ongoing, which was a sub-watershed study for the entire Lower Spencer Basin. So essentially covering the area from below the falls all the way out to Coots Paradise. And through this study, they identified that this section of Spencer Creek has been highly modified, and there was a lot of work that probably needs to be done to it over many years. But we don't, as the Conservation Authority, don't own much of it. So that would take a lot more work. But we did own, and that down in the bottom hand corner, I've kind of popped out. We do own these 2 parcels at Lower Spencer Creek. So the bottom corner of this photo is the west end of McMaster campus. And so we kind of, and then the ring road is Coots Drive. So we own those 2 plots. We call it Lower Spencer Creek's conservation area. There's a nice rail trail that runs through there. But by having and owning these, we could quickly actually implement something. So the project that they developed, they created a set of design goals for this area. So they wanted to restore a simulated natural channel function of the site. They wanted to introduce some habitat diversity to the degraded channel. And this channel was, my understanding is up to at least the 80s, maybe even creeping into the 90s. Bulldozers were run through it periodically to keep it clean from a flooding perspective. But what it did do is completely eliminate any habitat. So by doing some of this work, we could put some back. For target species, they wanted to target salmonid habitat. With the MNRF at the time, that this kind of dates towards the early years of the walleye stocking program. They wanted to create some available habitat so that if walleye were to come in, there'd be something there for them to potentially utilize to spawn on. Additionally, they wanted to create pike spawning habitat, again, trying to increase the opportunities for increasing the large predators. Wanted to work on the riparian buffer areas, and in general, just increase species habitat and diversity within Lower Spencer Creek. So Matrix Solutions was the company that got the tender to do the design. Based out of that, sort of those goals, they came up with dividing the area up into 3 areas. The upper reach, called the salmonid habitat focus reach. The middle reach was more targeted towards the walleye habitat, and then the lower section was just more of a supporting species, so a more open area with aquatic vegetation. Unfortunately, that section we weren't able to do due to funding. So for the project, we concentrated on the salmonid habitat and the walleye habitat improvement areas. For the both areas, there were riffles that were being installed, one in the salmon targeted habitat, and then the other 2 were in the walleye habitat. And these were built out, they had a pad, essentially the riffle structure itself, some boulder clusters ahead of it, and then an excavated pool. The shape of the riffle was designed to actually force the water into the center of the channel to help keep the pool excavated moving forward. This would improve the substrate diversity by adding these different size stones within the system. We're providing some scour protection along the banks to prevent erosion. The riffles are what we call the lungs of a stream, that disturbance of the surface as the water goes over the stones. That's where you get that oxygen interchange, just like in an aquarium where you have a bubbler to break the surface of the water. That's what we're doing here to increase oxygen. And then that variation in depths to provide variability within habitat. In addition to those riffles, we installed these lunker structures, which lunker is little underwater neighborhood. Oh, I can't even say the whole name out anymore. But essentially, it's an excavated cave into the bank, which replicates the habitat that would be created along a bend where water is actually in a natural stream is actually excavating or eroding around, say, a root wad of a tree. In this system, because it's straightened and the way the ice runs through, anything like that quickly gets ripped out. So these being artificially buried into the bank and then armored in with the stone, and then these stone ribs are added to actually deflect flow into the cavity to keep it flushed out from sediment settling into it. So the idea around here is creating the artificial undercut banks, habitat where young fish can hide. And then those larger stone ribs would again provide additional large stony material for potential walleye spawning habitat. So what does this look like actually as it is installed? So this is the first riffle, the salmonid riffle is the view, one I've picked for the view here. So this is before any work had been done. So this is the contractor starting to do the work, first moving down the stones that would be used to build those boulder clusters. You can kind of see it piled up on the bank on the left-hand side, the actual riffle material. And this is them moving it down and they're sort of pushing it out slowly as they work their way in to get the material into the site. And then this is it after they've spread that material out and built the riffle structure. And then now you're kind of seeing them, they've completed the bank on the far side and they're just cleaning up the bank on the left. And then you can see it's all been stabilized with erosion control blanket and seeded. And now as we move through the season, it starts to grow up. And that's sort of our new stabilized bank along those riffles. And this is, I think, the project was done in the end of August, beginning of September, and this would be, I think it was October by the time it was all growing up and stabilized. So you can see this nice change. You've got that nice riffling habitat that you couldn't see in the first photo. You've got these larger boulders, and then downstream of that is some nice pool habitat. So next, those lunkers, little underwater neighborhood keepers. There are 4 of these side by side. So these are about 4 feet long, about 2 to 3 feet deep, and about a foot and a half tall for the actual cavity itself. And then they had these stringers sticking out from them that actually anchored them further into the bank. Because if you can imagine, we're using those stone ribs to deflect flow into them. That's going to put a fair bit of force on these structures. And if they weren't anchored in, they'd be ripped out. So this is them going in, and then they're wrapped in the black material. That's landscape fabric, and that's just to keep the soil from kind of falling through all the gaps and filling them in as they're buried within the bank. And then on top of that, again, for that riparian habitat, they rebuilt the bank in these layers and buried mixes of dogwoods and willows within each layer to rebuild the shape of the bank. And this is what one of the 2 pairs looks like completed. And you can see in this photo, as the water's coming, because the water's flowing towards us in this photo, you can see as it comes to that rib, you can kind of see the lines where the riffle starts to point towards the bank, and that's that redirection. And then again, as you're standing here on the second set, you can see the water flowing at the bank. But overall, these features are all fairly low within the system so that they don't actually back much, if anything, water up within the system. And so through this project, it went fairly quickly. So this is again that pool with those boulder clusters in front of that first riffle. We did that first riffle, was completed a Thursday, Friday. We went away for the weekend. We came back on Monday, and in that pool ahead, and actually the one downstream as well, there was this blue color. We were first kind of wondering what is this? And then slowly we looked at it and could actually start to make out the backs of fish. And so this is a giant school of fish that moved in over the weekend after we created this habitat. And as we went along, as we created it, the fish moved in and in. And I had a GoPro, so I stuck it in, and this is sort of a shot of that cluster of fish. They'll build it and they will come. And then I actually have a couple of videos here of this is the main one, the best one for the collection of species. So here you can see kind of along the bottom, you've got a few yellow perch mixed in, and then a lot of up to the mid-level or the white perch. As you move up into the top area, you get to see those orange fin fish. Those unfortunately are the rudd, the non-native we don't like. But up there at the top, there's you can see a lot of silvery fish, and those are the gizzard shad swimming up there. So it's a real mixed school that has moved into these areas. So this was really exciting for us to create it, and then instantly these fish were moving in to start to utilize this habitat. Um, it was quite a rewarding experience to see how quickly nature was responding to the work that we had done. We're just about done. Just like a video of the ocean, fish moving about. And then for the second one here, these are the gizzard shad that you couldn't really see in the other video. This is one where it's just mostly a school of gizzard shad. So just so you can have a chance to see what they would look like from a different angle. So that's everything I have for you for tonight. Contact information. Thank you. Anybody have any questions?
That's great. Thanks so much, Colin.
Thanks.
So folks, if you do have any questions for Colin and the work that he was describing, feel free to enter it into the Q&A. I can start, Colin.
Okay.
We can start off with a question. What is your favorite part of the job?
Ooh, that's a good question. It's twofold. I think the sampling event and getting to see what species are out there is really rewarding, particularly because we continue to catch fish that we haven't seen, or we catch fish that we haven't seen in a while, and that's always fun. So like the bowfin that photo I had shown, that one we caught the first time we caught them was the first year I had started at Lower Spencer, and then we didn't see them again actually until 2023. And the neat part about it was that because of that ice scouring and everything else that goes on at Lower Spencer, there's this specific kind of need the right habitat to form, and it's overhanging vegetation along the edge is what it was there, and that's what was present in 2018 when we caught them. When we went back to the site, I looked at it, I'm like, I could see that same vegetation. I'm like, we're gonna pull bowfin out of there, and sure enough, we did. So that kind of getting those species is always good. But for me, I really like to do the restoration and seeing how fast not only wildlife respond, but also just sometimes the environment itself tells you. I've done other projects where on streams where as you do the work, the stream gets louder as the water is crashing over being able to again crash over the rocks and stones, and that noise is very positive. So restoration projects are also a big one for me.
That's great. Before we go any further with questions on Colin, I know there were some questions around water quality. Absolutely, future talks can focus on water quality and those types of issues. We just wanted to focus more on the topics that are at hand today and focusing on fish populations. So Colin, is there any evidence that walleyes are using the newly improved habitat?
No, not to my knowledge. I did have one fisherman tell me that he had seen one in there, but we haven't caught any in our sampling, and I've not actually seen any in any of the schools or videos that I've taken. So at this point, I would say no. And I think that was sort of a lofty goal when they put it in the original design. So it's there, and just kind of wait and see what happens.
Great. Okay. Next one from Ryan. In Toronto, they have been installing sunken forests. Is this something Hamilton is considering for creating habitat?
Interesting. I've never heard of sinking forests before.
Or sunken forests. I don't know if there's a difference.
But we did at Christie Lake, or at least the ecologists before me. Christie Lake, back when it was developed, is a created reservoir. And there wasn't a lot, when they created it, there wasn't a lot of fish habitat. So one of the projects that went in back in the mid 2000s, I think it was, they actually installed they buried trees in and root wads in along the shoreline amongst other rock clusters. So I don't know if that's similar to what this buried forests are, but that we have installed woody material into Christie Lake as an example. On top of that, at Valens, they had to remove a bunch of ash a few years back from emerald ash borer, and it was during the winter, and it was so I was kind of talking with the staff there, and they're kind of wondering if there's anything we do, and I suggested that they drag it actually out into the reservoir into a specific spot. We kind of piled them all together as a way of creating some more woody habitat within Valens, and so they did that, and it's there, and some of it sticks out of the water. So we actually end up getting with birds sitting on it as well. So you kind of have that inner water habitat, and then also some terrestrial habitat for birds and other things to utilize. We've like bald eagles have sat on those branches from those trees. So it's a kind of a neat other thing what we've done with wood in the structure. But I don't know if that actually matches the sunken forests.
Yeah, just for some added context, Colin, Ryan mentioned sunken forests is using trunks encased with concrete at their base that are then dropped down. You may have the wrong name, but didn't know whether that would ring any bells for you.
So I didn't know they were called sunken forests. I would be hesitant to actually approach it with using the concrete. I would probably try and find another way to get the woody material out there. In the case of Valens, we were able to, because the water level was down, and it was frozen, we just dragged them out and anchored them in place. And then the lake kind of rises up around them. And then at Christie, they were mechanically buried within to anchor them. But yeah, we could look at, particularly for 50 Point Pond, that might be a way to approach to get some more habitat into it, looking at whether we can use that or some other anchoring material to bring some stumps in that down. But that's something to consider. Thank you.
Great. Okay, next one. Are most of the spawning species in the watershed from fish that spend the rest of their time in Hamilton Harbour, or do they head out to other water bodies?
So the majority of the fish that are within the watershed are resident species. So most of those fish that I was showing were resident to the watershed, and that's where they'll remain. We do get the rainbows and Chinook salmon that run up. Additionally, the gizzard shad and probably several of the other species will run in during different times of the year to spawn and then move back out. But by and large, most of those fish are resident species.
Okay, great. Let me see if I can make sure I'm answering or speaking to this properly. If walleye imprint to spawning areas, should stocking efforts include Spencer Creek now that habitat has been improved?
That was discussed many years ago, but I don't know if it ever got that far along. That's more of an MNRF decision that's kind of outside of us.
Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry?
Forestry, yeah.
Great, okay. We have one more question here. What can we as a general public do to help with any specific areas discussed today? I love that question.
It's a good question.
And John, if you have any thoughts too on your end, by all means.
I think one of the big ones is being informed about your watershed. So attending something like this to learn more about it, and then spreading that information about of what's here and what's going on, and then looking for those opportunities to help. So some examples that are likely to come up would be as far as riparian improvements at Lower Spencer. We're also doing terrestrial wetland plantings. And some of those are done as community planting. So looking for those opportunities to come out and help plant the vegetation that we're putting in to help improve the habitat. John, did you have any?
Maybe one that just jumps quick to mind is I spoke about some of the invasive species we have in the harbor, the goldfish and the rudd, and we think that the goldfish in particular are sort of repeat introductions into the system because we do still see these big, bright orange 2-pound goldfish. So there's some signage now. The city's been fabulous actually, and actually putting signs at stormwater ponds because we think that's a vector, but also direct release into the harbor of goldfish, your pet goldfish. There's other ways to not rehome them when you're done with them as a species. And also the rudd we think is largely transferred through things like bait. So being really aware with what you're releasing back into these systems and stopping the spread of invasives, I think is a big thing the public can play a major role in. Yeah. And being here today is fabulous. So.
Totally. If I could add too, as part of the city's watershed action plan, we do have a section on things that the public can do to help. Things like using salt responsibly for de-icing your driveway or sidewalk, instead of washing your car on the driveway, go to a licensed commercial car wash that actually has infrastructure underneath the car wash to help separate some of the oil and grit and other things. Really make sure that only rain and snowmelt are going down your catch basins. You can disconnect your downspout off your house, off your roof leader to a permeable surface and minimize extra stormwater entering our combined sewer system. There's lots of things folks can do to help with fish populations in the harbor. Okay, so next, let me check what I have next. On average, how many walleye are lifted over the fishway annually?
I'm not sure if John knows that number. Oh, there we go. John's got a big 0 sign.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think they've only seen 1 or 2 over the past sort of 15, 20 years, and I'm not aware of any being lifted over recently. Yeah. And I should have said too during my talk that, and I did respond to one of the questions in the chat about the walleye in particular. Walleye can spawn in rivers. They can also spawn in lakes on shoals. And we think the bulk of the walleye that are in the current system are actually lake shoal spawning walleye. Because when we've tracked them using telemetry, we've seen none of them moving into the tributaries. So we think they're actually like a different, more focused on the lake side, basically.
Okay. Next up, you mentioned stopping equipment from clearing pike spawning habitat. Is there anything that can be done to increase the quantity and quality of pike spawning habitat in Spencer or Coutts? This is for Colin.
I honestly, the one project that comes to mind that was done many years ago, I don't know how functional it would be, is we do have a culvert that was installed in the mid 2000s to get additional water to flood actually between Spencer Creek and the Desjardins Canal, providing cleaner water to that side of the harbor to kind of just to dilute the water from the wastewater treatment plant. But that additionally, that floods that upper wetland habitat, and they are wetland spawners. I just don't know if the flow is actually times out to when the pike are actually in the system, because it's quite a ways up into the more terrestrially habitat area of the wetland. But that was a project that was done with that as a possibility as well. I don't know if it does function that way, but that would be more of a question, I think, for the folks at RPG who do the monitoring of Coutts Paradise and their work, and whether they see anything happening up at the top end.
Yeah, just to add to that, Mike, obviously the fishway is a fascinating part of the fish management in Hamilton Harbor, and we wanted to make sure that we did it justice. And so one of our future talks, we will look to the RBG to give a talk on kind of all the work that they do in Coutts Paradise and Grindstone Creek, in particular the fishway. We just wanted to be respectful of time that's a whole presentation all in itself. So stay tuned.
Okay, other than some nice comments from Derek, I think that's all the questions we have.
Okay, Colin, thank you so much for sharing your slides today. Really appreciate it. We're gonna move into kind of the end part of our talk today. I just wanted to say how exciting it was at one part of our talk today, we had a high of, upwards of 90 people that were here live for parts of our talk today. And that is incredible for the kind of the second webinar in a series. You'll notice here that I have a little teaser for public webinar number 3. We don't have a date yet. I'm probably looking for kind of sometime in June, is if I can kind of, line up the right speakers. Lots of the questions that were asked today are about the water quality. No surprise, and that is certainly something that Mike is on the coordinating committee that kind of helps to decide kind of, what topics can we bring, what presenters do we have, kind of what interest is there from the public. So we are definitely going to take the questions that were asked, and we're going to take that back to our coordinating committee to kind of get that take that feedback and kind of line up who we're going to have kind of up next in this series. Carolyn, I know we've got some kind of poll questions at the end. They're a little bit different, so I'll let Carolyn launch those for you.
Sure, just two questions here to go. You can take a few moments with them too. We'll leave them a little longer. I'll read them out loud. So the first one is, what was something you learned that you didn't know before about the fish of Hamilton Harbour? And the second one is, what excites you the most about Hamilton Harbour? So if you can take a second to answer some of those, we'll just leave this screen up for a bit here. I believe if you are finished with it, you can exit out of the way as well.
Okay, so while you're doing that, I just wanted to again thank you so much, both to both of our presenters and to Mike for facilitating the questions. There were a lot of questions. We tried to answer as many live as we could in the time that we had, but I did notice both Mike and John were trying to answer questions as they could. So if you did ask a question and it wasn't answered live, take a look at the Q&A. I think they hopefully should have appeared for you with the answers. So again, this is a series. Thank you for coming to this series. Our plan is to have 2 to 4 webinars a year. We're hoping the next one will be in the spring. Please stay engaged with us. Follow one of our socials or check out our website where a recording of today's session will be posted within a week. Our goal and the one nice thing about the webinar concept versus an in-person is we can do a recording of this session. It will be posted then on our website, and that will stay there. So, you know, in a year from now, if new people kind of come into the area or start work in the area and want to know about the fish populations, this will be there as a resource. So if you were unable to attend some deep dive webinar number 1, our primary guest speaker was from the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and spoke about their treaty lands and territory. It was quite fascinating. If you don't know about that topic, please take an opportunity and go back and check out our video. I think that's it. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. And I really hope that we get the chance for you to come back and see you again at a future deep dive webinar. Thank you very much. Have a great night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.